All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Gianna Christopher. I'm one of the reference librarians here at the Chelmsford Public Library, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for our Art on Thursdays program. You're welcome throughout the presentation to enter any of your questions into either the chat or the Q&A portion of your Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free, and we'll get to those questions at the end of the presentation. So once again, welcome to Art on Thursdays presents Gearge Tooker, Modern Life and Magic Realism. Gearge Tooker often depicted the tensions of modern life and inhuman bureaucracies. As a gay man active in the civil rights movement, Tooker explored boundary-breaking subjects in his work while also conjuring powerful scenes of quiet beauty. This program provides an introduction to the artist, his life, and his remarkable body of work. And now to briefly introduce our speaker for tonight, welcome Jane Oneail. She's the founder of Culturally Curious, an arts education consulting firm specializing in art appreciation programs. She curates and delivers programs throughout New England and beyond. Oneail holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University. Born and raised in New Hampshire, she has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. For more information, please visit imculturallycurious.com, and I'll be sure to enter that website into the chat just as this program starts for you folks to check out at home after the presentation. And I'll also put some of the upcoming programs we have at the Chelmsford Library as well for you to check out. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Jane.
Thank you so much, Gianna, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight, for taking time out of this absolutely gorgeous day. I always panic a little when I'm competing with good weather, so I really appreciate you tuning in, spending your evening with me. Tonight, we are going to be getting to know the artist Gearge Tooker. Don't be ashamed if you've never heard of him before. I feel like he's one of the best kept secrets in art history. He was a 20th century American artist, and he created these really remarkable realist and sometimes surrealist images, these works about modern life. But beyond that, he really touches on a lot of timeless themes, and we'll be getting into those themes over the course of the evening. Let me give you, and we will be getting back to this gorgeous image too. Let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend this next hour together with our program overview. We have this kind of haunting scene from Tooker over here. It's called Festa from 1948. This is to kind of whet your appetite. We're going to get started with an introduction to Gearge Tooker and his concept of magical realism. We see a little bit of it here. And then we'll look at different themes, different categories of his paintings, because he would return to the same themes again and again and again. Now, he's best known for what are known as his public pictures, his works about social commentary. We'll also look at Windows and Doors, Light and Love, Sleep and Death, and finish up with his legacy. Now, let's get started with our introduction to the artist. Okay, here's Gearge Tooker as a young boy, probably around the age of 7 or so, and then in a photograph from around the age of 20. Gearge Tooker was born in 1920 in Brooklyn, New York, and he was raised Episcopalian. His mother, I should say, was half Cuban, and so he really always considered himself sort of mixed race, though, of course, he could easily pass as white. At the age of 7, he began taking art lessons, so art was always a big part of his life. And even though he was from a very solidly middle-class background, he did end up attending Phillips Academy and then went on to attend Harvard. And for him, it was a little bit of a culture shock because he could see really how the privileged class in America lived. And that sort of developed within him this real sense of the inequalities that existed in America, and that became sort of a point of passion for him. It was a topic that he returns to again and again in his art. Now, when he was at Harvard, he studied literature, but he was longing to paint the whole time. And so, of course, that's something that he basically did almost immediately after he graduated. Now, Tooker was a gay man in America, and I should say pretty much an openly gay man in America at a time when it was, of course, not socially acceptable to be out. But his sexuality, I think, created in him a sense of empathy for anybody who thought of themselves as an outsider. And it further helped to develop this sense of empathy in his art. It guided which kinds of subjects he was choosing along the way. So he graduates from Harvard. He knows he wants to be an artist. He moves to New York City and he begins studying painting at the Art Students League under a social realist artist named Reginald Marsh. And over here on the left is an example of Reginald Marsh's paintings. It's a picture of people coming off of the subway. It's from 1930. And we get this sense of tremendous movement, of energy and vitality. Marsh was really good at just cramming his pictures full of all of the details of modern life, from the details of the newspaper to the styles that the women were wearing. You really felt like you were in that sweep of people coming off of the subway. So we can see from this picture over here on the right that Gearge Tooker is like literally just taking a page from his teacher at this point. He's working on the subway. He's creating the sketch. He's really interested in what this woman on the subway is wearing and what she's reading. And we'll see there's just a few lessons that he kind of holds on to when it comes to his experiences at the Art Students League. But he does return to some big themes from Reginald Marsh along the course of his career. It's really his contemporaries that have an enormous effect on Gearge Tooker. In particular, the artist Paul Cadmus, whose work we see over here on the left, and then the artist William Christopher, whose work Red Interior we see over here on the right. Now, believe it or not, Gearge Tooker actually had relationships with both of these artists. But I think you'll see, this is, again, sort of a little preview of what's to come too, because Cadmus over here creates these very massive kind of solid figures. You have this real sense of the roundness of their bodies and their forms. And then over here, we see with William Christopher, this sense of replicating one figure again and again and again. And that's certainly something that Gearge Tooker goes back to. His relationship with Cadmus was very brief, but or relatively brief, but they maintained a lifelong relationship. When it comes to William Christopher, they became lifelong partners. So let me give you a little bit of an introduction to how that played out in Gearge Tooker's life. Here he is with William Christopher in the photograph on the left. Now, they were the loves of each other's lives. They met in New York City in the mid-1950s, and they were together right up until William Christopher's death in 1973. And even following Christopher's death, Tooker did not take on any other relationships for decades until his death. So when it comes to Tooker's artwork, some art historians would say that all of his paintings are implicitly homosexual, not explicitly. But one of his earliest paintings, this one over here on the right called Children and Spastics from 1946, is really said to be one of his most direct commentaries on homosexuality. So if we delve into this fascinating painting, it's an almost uncomfortable painting because it seems familiar. It seems like the elements here are recognizable. It could potentially be set in our own time, but there are qualities here that make it seem like it's from another time too. What's essentially happening here is that there are 5 children dressed in black and a black dog, and they are taunting and tormenting these very pale men that the title characterizes as spastics. These pale men, 2 of them have their arms exposed too. And so that kind of heightens their vulnerability. We see them as outsiders. We understand that they are victims of these children. And Gearge Tooker put these men in what were considered sort of effeminate or homosexual poses, gestures in this painting. He's sort of capitalizing on homosexual stereotypes here. So he's really kind of pointing out sort of explicitly how homosexuals are being treated in the world way back in 1946. So this is just an early example of how Tooker's life experiences are informing the content of his work. So he's still a very young man. He's only 26 years old. Let's see what he does in the next year or so. It brings us to this remarkable self-portrait that he does in 1947. He's about 27 years old when he paints it. It's a round painting in a tondo format here, and it's roughly 16 inches in diameter. So it's almost as though you're looking in a mirror as you look at it. And Tooker had gone to the Cape. He had gone to Provincetown, and he cut his hair very, very short. So in this painting, we get a great sense of the shape of his head, the volume of his head, and these circles, the circle of the painting, the circle of his head, his eyes, even the architectural detail back here. And then finally the nautilus, which he ends up adding almost as an afterthought, all reinforce these basic forms that are organizing the picture so beautifully here. Another kind of interesting stylistic flourish is that he adds the sweater around his neck, and he even knots it there. Which is kind of fascinating because he's already wearing a sweater, but some art historians point out that it sort of supports this neck here that's doing all the heavy lifting with the head, but it also kind of makes him look like a monk or somebody from another time in some ways. Now, let me just give you a sense in terms of how spot on his painting is for this time. There's almost like this otherworldly quality to it, but he has certainly captured his likeness here, and we will see his likeness again and again in so many of his paintings. It's known as the Tooker man. So many of his works seem to have self-portraits or works or figures that are inspired by his own likeness. Now, he is painting this self-portrait right around the time that Jackson Pollock is delving into non-objective abstract works like the work that we see on the right called Full Fathom 5 from the same year. And of course, Jackson Pollock is stealing the limelight from any struggling artist who's working in New York City in the middle of the 20th century. George Tooker didn't really mind it. He was never, he didn't need to be a household name. But let's just say that figurative painting, like this realistic figurative painting, almost seemed conservative. It seemed like a throwback in comparison to what was happening in the art world at the time. But for George Tooker, that worked out just fine. He thought of himself as like a slow thinker, a methodical thinker, and that ties in really well with his process here too. So we see him as a young man working on a sketch over here on the left in the photograph. And then on the right, we see a painting that he did in the 1960s. This is in the collection of the Hood Museum at Dartmouth. And it's just simply a carton of eggs. Why would he paint a carton of eggs? Because he was working in egg tempera, which is almost an anachronistic style of painting. Most painters work in oil painting, and you can sort of build up the layers of oil painting, and it's a more flexible, almost more vibrant medium because you have this kind of glistening quality to an oil paint. But egg tempera is something that requires a real kind of slow, methodical approach. So it requires the slow buildup of paint, and it requires you to constantly go back to your paints, otherwise they dry up pretty quickly. So with the advent of oil paints, there's not too many artists that choose to work with egg yolk tempera. I can think of, for instance, Andrew Wyeth was another egg yolk tempera artist, but it's such a painstaking process that many artists just choose not to do it. Now, I said it's anachronistic. It's really a medium that was popular going back to really early Renaissance. So I've got just a detail of Botticelli's famous Venus over here from the Birth of Venus in the late 1400s, and an example of George Tooker's painting on the right, which I think was very clearly inspired by Botticelli's Venus over here. So we can see that he's thinking of these figures that seem almost like statues in these paintings because it takes more time to create an egg tempera painting. There seems to be this stillness in so many of his works. And so not only do we have the similar pose, that's the similar way these women's heads are hinged on their necks, but we also have that silence, that stillness with these works. So tempera is normally applied in very thin, semi-opaque and transparent layers, and it dries quickly, like I said, so you can't really mess around with it once it's there. It has this almost linear quality to it. Now, because it cannot be applied in thick layers as oil paints can, tempera paintings rarely have the deep color saturation that oil paintings can achieve. It's really oftentimes they tend to look almost more like pastels. This painting here, we do see some nice color saturation, and we'll see that for Gearge Tooker, he manages to make his paintings kind of glow in many cases. So thinking about his process just a little bit more here, I apologize for the blurriness of the image on the left, but I wanted to show you how he worked with these preparatory sketches before he created one of these paintings. He was so slow in his process that he would only make about 3, maybe 4 paintings a year. So he would really develop the images through sketches. And this is a painting called The Bird Watchers over here from 1948. And you can see how he's really organizing a picture like this with like the series of these Gothic pointed arches. And of course, it's a picture that seems to recall aspects of religious painting here too. So he develops that and then slowly lays in the paint. Oh, I should say that he then transfers the sketch to a panel and does that using a grid. So he's copying one square at a time. It's a laborious process, but like I said he thought of himself as a slow thinker, and this allowed him to really develop his thoughts along the way. So you can see the same care in composition with this seemingly informal portrait, this self-portrait over here from the 1980s. He's wearing this wide brim hat and he's gazing at us as though into a mirror as he works with his paintbrush in hand. But you spend a little bit of extra time with it and you can see that there's this V format right here at the center of the picture. There's sort of another triangle kind of separating the space and this lighted space where the head is in the upper corner over here. So it's really all about the organization of these basic shapes very often in his pictures. Now, back to Tooker's life for just a moment. Beginning in 1957, Tooker and his partner, William Christopher, start spending their weekends and vacationing in rural Vermont, up near Dartmouth, actually. And they moved there full time in 1960 so that William Christopher can teach at Dartmouth. It was this very quiet life, a big change from the city, but it was a change that suited both of them so well. Tooker stayed engaged with issues that mattered to him, though. He and William Christopher joined the Dartmouth College branch of the NAACP. Apparently, I think it was an all-white branch. But the civil rights movement mattered so much to them that in 1965, they traveled to Alabama so that they could take part in one of the pivotal civil rights marches from Selma to Montgomery, along with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So on the right, we see a more mysterious work, another self-portrait here, but this time he's heavy lidded. He's sort of looking downward, and his head almost seems to be compressed by these two hands. One of them is his hand that holds the paintbrush in this kind of thoughtful position at his chin here, but the other hand belongs to this androgynous angel, a black figure in the background. We can see that this figure has wings and sort of a halo type effect. So it's as though he's getting some divine inspiration, or perhaps some pressure, some control, there's all sorts of speculation in terms of what this relationship is. But I share this image because Gearge Tooker is one of the few white men I can think of in the 20th century that was really passionate about the civil rights movement and integration, and was showing integrated scenes even before the civil rights movement. Okay, so as we round out on his life, I'll just share with you that William Christopher, Gearge Tooker's partner, died in 1973. And just a few years later, Gearge Tooker, who was raised Episcopalian, converts to Catholicism and becomes deeply involved in his church in Windsor, Vermont. So the last few decades of his life, he is living this sort of quiet, artistic, spiritual life in the solitude of this Vermont home. He would wake up every day, he would go to mass, he would go home to a studio and basically sketch into the evening. And he worked right up until his death in 2011. So we've got a self-portrait over here from 1985 and a photo from him of him that's in the collection at Dartmouth from right around the same time. Now, as we finish up this section, I just wanted to touch on this idea of magical realism because it's a fascinating element to Gearge Tooker. He once said, "I am after painting reality impressed on the mind so hard that it returns as a dream, but I'm not after painting dreams as such or fantasy." That gives us a little bit of a glimpse into what he's doing. But I wanted to share these two images, which I think complement each other in such wonderful ways. They're like a study of opposites. We've got red carpet on the left and the sleepers one on the right. So we've got consciousness over here. We've got these watchers, and then we've got unconsciousness. And you know, three men versus three women, three versus three men. So Tooker's paintings almost always seem set in the modern world. There's something about the rug here, the furniture, or the cut of their clothes that looks like it's from the 20th century. But he never gets too specific. He lets there remain this sort of sense of timelessness in so many of his paintings. So what gives these paintings the touch of magical realism or even surrealism? Well, first, his style of painting is very realistic. I mean, it can be close to photographic, as we saw with that round self-portrait. But once again, he's always careful to not get too specific. So we almost get into like the uncanny valley in some of his images. But with both of these paintings that we see here, we see that he oftentimes includes the same figure again and again and again, as suggesting that they are separate and the same simultaneously. This looks like the same woman that repeated 3 times here. What would it mean that she's sitting in different positions with her back to each other, with her back kind of facing the other versions of herself? He's also painstakingly avoiding narrative in his paintings, almost like Edward Hopper, if you're familiar with his works. And I should say that they were working at the same time and very familiar with each other's works. In the red carpet over here, he gives us these women. They're sitting, they're smoking, they're watching. They seem alert, maybe a little bit anxious here, but we have no idea as to why. We do know that he glimpsed a similar scene in somebody's basement one day as he's walking by a building, and that's what inspired this, but we have to fill in the gaps ourselves. When it comes to the men lying on the beach, were they at a raucous party? Are they shipwrecked from a boat crash in the middle of the ocean? We just don't know what has happened here. So it's really fun, I think, to look at these images and to create your own story around them. And so let's proceed on and see what else Gearge Tooker has in store for us. Like I said, we're going to get started with these public pictures, the social commentary pictures. And these are the works that he is most famous for. He started these in the 1950s, so he's just about 30 years old. That's really young to be making such an impact in the world, right? This first picture here is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was painted in 1956, and it's called The Government Bureau. So here we are in this bureaucratic administrative space, and it's staffed by these identical looking figures with, like, you know, the dark circles around their eyes and the bags are under their eyes, and they sit behind these frosted panels of glass with just the little cutout here, enabling some sense of limited communication. And below that frosted glass, we can see that their hands are on these identical keyboards, like these kinds of machines here. We sense that there's this tremendous bleakness in their roles, but even bleaker than that are the experiences of these people who are standing in line, waiting to get their problems addressed by these bureaucrats here. This is a space that feels like it's an infinite maze of waiting, of inhuman red tape and horrible regulation. So not surprisingly, this was inspired by the artist's actual experiences. He and William Christopher had purchased a brownstone in Brooklyn. They were renovating it, converting it from a rooming house into apartments, and Tooker had to navigate all of the local bureaucracy to secure the proper permits to do this work. And it resulted in weeks of headaches and frustration. So in his mind, you could sort of copy and paste room after room, space after space of these bureaucrats who have no interest in actually helping you. And we've all been there, right? We've been to the DMV, we've been in line for security at the airport. And those are experiences that don't make you feel like a person, they make you feel like a number, that you are just a document to be processed, and nobody's in any rush to do it. So this is, of course, a distinctly modern experience. And the results that Gearge Tooker gives us here are vaguely terrifying. Notice too that our perspective here is sort of from that of a child. We're looking up in this picture, giving us this sense of fear in this space. So for Gearge Tooker, this was a space that really a picture that represented the misuse of authority without responsibility. And so we are, our hearts go out to all of these figures that are just waiting in line to be processed, but they are nearly identical. This is like the back of the Tooker man here. Now, probably his best known painting is this one here called The Subway. This was painted in 1950, and it's in the collection of the Whitney Museum of American Art. So once again, we're all familiar with this feeling in a space like this. Maybe you've been in a parking garage or like in the bowels of some enormous building where you're just not sure if you're safe. You're just not sure how to navigate the space, and you're far from sort of the surface of the land here. You're underground, and of course, the subway has this way of kind of breaking down societal connections that exist above ground. We don't look at each other. We don't acknowledge each other. It's all about kind of shutting down and staying in your kind of safe little space here. You just don't engage. But here we see the terrifying looks on the faces of people that are navigating this space. So Tooker presents this as a unique fear in city life. This is about going into the subterranean labyrinth, and it is a labyrinth. These spaces just seem to proceed in every direction imaginable. There's no natural light to speak of, and there are no trains. It's just about getting around. And you're surrounded by these sour, kind of soulless faces of all of these strangers. Now, it's like dehumanizing architecture that he's used here. And just to make it as complex as possible, Gearge Tooker actually used 3 different vanishing points to make this architecture as elaborate as possible, to isolate and to divide these figures. Now, it's a picture that's all about dread. We're supposed to identify with this woman at the front, who is kind of clutching her belly and looking off to the side. We have the sense that we're in this kind of modern purgatory here. Gearge Tooker said, I didn't like the subway. I think it's obvious I didn't like a lot of things about living in the city. Now, I'm going to show you just one little detail here that has always sort of terrified me among all of these figures that just kind of look copied and pasted. Way down here near the center, but at the end of this long corridor, there is just this other woman in red, and she's got this fur stole around her shoulders. She seems to be kind of squatting, but leaning up against the wall. And it looks as though she's like wearing a crown. She also has this sour look on her face. And she's dwelling in a place where nobody stays. There's something really strange about that. This is supposed to be a place where everybody's moving around. I always think of her as like the queen of the underworld here. I also want to quickly compare this to the work of an early Renaissance master, somebody that Gearge Tooker would have been really familiar with. This is Piero della Francesca's painting, The Flagellation of Christ, from the 1450s. And here we get the solidness of the figures once again. and that sense that there is really no movement. Even though this woman's stepping forward, we get this sense that she's been in that position for forever and she's never really going to move from it. We also have this jarring use of perspective in Piero del Francesca's painting that takes us from these large figures in the foreground to the smaller figures in the distance. And so we see something similar in Gearge Tooker's The Subway. If we compare it with his master Reginald Marsh over here, we can see that he's come sort of a great distance away from the way Marsh painted. It's the same subject, obviously, but Marsh is all about the movement, the vitality of the city. And Tooker here is giving us sort of the anxiety of living in the city. So much so that even today, we tap into those same anxieties inspired by Gearge Tooker. There was a photographer who did a whole series of these photos inspired by Tooker right around 2016. The photographer's name is Paul Vandekar, but he was really trying to touch on the same feeling that people had right around the time of the election in 2016. So clearly this painting still resonates today. It brings us to his next public picture called The Waiting Room. This is from 1959. It's at the Smithsonian. And here we see another iteration of a particularly 20th century brand of anxiety and alienation. We are looking at people in a waiting area who are essentially waiting to wait. They can't live their lives because they are in this interminable pattern, holding pattern here. And if we see these little stalls, they're numbered, we're up above 100. So we get this sense that this is an infinite space of waiting. We don't even get the sense that there's real privacy. We don't even, or the necessity of these stalls or people changing in them. Some people are just in the central space over here. There's an inhumanity to this space. We catch little glimpses of people's faces, but we don't have full expressions, even with this figure whose eyes are obscured by the glasses. What we do see is this horrible grimace on the back of this magazine that this woman is holding up right at the center of the picture. And it's just kind of the perfect expression of this unhappy place, right? It's a terrifying vision of what modern life looks like. Once again, it's a purgatory. It's not people who can live their lives. They're essentially waiting to be processed in some sort of bureaucracy. So Tooker's paintings on this subject get even a little bit more abstract. This one is called Landscape with Figures from 1966. So this is much later now. Have you ever worked in an office cubicle? You've probably experienced something like this before. We see all of these boxes. For the most part, heads are bowed. Some of the eyes are closed. And there's just a few people that seem to have this kind of awakening that are looking up and beyond the boxes here. So we have this sense of people being alienated from each other by this dehumanizing architecture, maybe even in a sense alienated from themselves. You're never going to believe this, but a steel company actually requested the use of this image in the late 1960s to recruit new employees. I don't think any one of us would really want to work in a job that looks like this. Tooker declined that, stating specifically that he didn't want to be a part of the military industrial complex. Now, if this looks like hell to you, this might be what lunch in hell looks like for you. So this is the break room, right? So this is a picture called Lunch from 1964. And we see all of these figures compressed into these tight rows. They're at these skinny lunch counters here. Their heads are bent, their eyes are lowered, and they are trying very hard not to make any sort of connection with each other. They're very guardedly ignoring each other. And we've all kind of done something like this in like a fast food restaurant at some place. But there is something incredibly sad about eating among other people and not having this sense of like community around it, especially when it comes to bread. Bread is all about building community with other people, breaking bread together. Now, there's another social layer to this picture, which I think is important to understanding. We see just little bits and pieces of people's faces here. The only face that we see in its entirety is the face of this Black man. So he is right at the center. George Tooker is emphasizing this is an integrated lunch counter here. And this is painted at a time, 1964, when throughout the South, there were nonviolent protesters integrating lunch counters as part of the civil rights movement, as in the fight for equality. So we have George Tooker very subtly making a nod to this changing political climate in the United States. And clearly the fact that it's integrated here is important to him, even if lunch here doesn't look like the best lunch. We'll finish up this section with one more image that I think speaks to Tooker's interest in equality and civil rights. This is a picture called Supper from 1963. And once again, Tooker shows us a Black man who is sitting before a meal, and he is flanked by these two white men. You might even say that the white men look identical to each other, and you might even say they look like self-portraits of the artist. But the Black man is holding the bread, and he is very clearly the protagonist, and he looks out at us. Once again, it feels like it is set in present day with the cut of the men's shirts, but the subject here and the reference to supper is a reference to the history of art and the history of religion, because in this case, it is a reference to traditional depictions of the supper at Emmaus, which is sort of a favorite subject for artists through the centuries. But it's a story from the Gospels when the resurrected Christ, who is essentially incognito, appears before two of his disciples, and they don't know it's him until he breaks this bread. So then they realize that it's Jesus who has come back to life. He has been resurrected. But up until this moment, they don't recognize him. So to show incognito Jesus as this kind of enlightened, peace-filled Black man was very much a revolution at the time. And for George Tooker, it was inspired 100% by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He saw Christ-like qualities in the way that King conducted himself publicly in the civil rights movement. So for him to include a Black figure in the place of what would traditionally have been Christ was a pretty unusual choice at the time. So let's turn our attention now to some of his other favorite themes when it comes to painting. And I just kind of put these themes together in ways that I thought were interesting, but you can definitely see a trajectory as we move through them. So, all right, this first image here is called Gypsy from 1951, and he painted it while he was living in New York City. He was living around West 18th Street. And he would go home at night and he would see these little shop fronts where there were fortune tellers. And this isn't a direct depiction of one of them, but this is loosely inspired by it. So we see this woman, we get the sense that it's evening time. There's this bright, presumably electric light in the back of the room. When it comes to George Tooker, you never see the light source. And she's sitting in the shop front. We've got this great mix of patterns and these kind of bright, warm colors here, but she seems sort of relaxed, sort of tired, maybe a little bit guarded at the end of the day. Her eyes are kind of cast down, but this curtain behind her is just glowing. And beyond it, we can see, or through it, we can see the silhouette of what I think is a man, and he is standing in profile. So that prompts us to sort of think about what that relationship is. Now, this is a figure that was no doubt inspired by art historical figures as well. This is a famous painting from the 1800s done by the French artist Jacques-Louis David, showing a reclining woman in almost a similar pose. There's a whole history of art of these reclining women. But with the Gypsy painting, Tooker suggests, like I said, more of a weary woman, not a woman who is like a Parisian socialite as we have over here on the left. Now, we see a little bit of this influence from his partner, or at least some influence going back and forth, because we saw William Christopher's work before with another seated figure like this with her feet up. This painting was actually done about a decade after the Gypsy. So you can imagine these two working and living together, and their ideas are kind of spilling over into each other's paintings. Now, Tooker would go back to a theme again and again and again. For the most part, he would take breaks before returning to a theme. So it was unusual, very unusual for him to paint, of his 3 paintings that year to just do gypsies. So in this case, we have Gypsy from 1951, and these 2 women over here, which are it's called Gypsies. This is from 1968, but there's an immediacy to this where you get the sense that he's gone from one to the next, that there isn't like 2 decades between them. So here he's updated the theme just a little bit. We have the woman with her arms crossed in the foreground. He's added another woman just beyond her. And he's made them look more distinctly African American now. Now they're not, they don't have these downcast eyes. They look like they are looking out directly at us. We get this sense of a no-nonsense confrontation that could be happening right now. And once again, we have this glowing curtain just beyond them. This male figure that had been existing there in the earlier painting, now he's kind of turned. We see him frontally, and we also see that he's about to pull this curtain aside. There's so much mystery in a painting like this. What's his relationship to these women? Is he going to confront us in just a moment? What are we going to see when he pulls back this curtain? Well, Tooker loves the mystery of a curtain like this, and he goes back to this theme again and again. Look, this is almost the exact same pose here. This brings us to this series of window paintings that he did over the course of a number of years. I think he did upwards of 10 window paintings. This is window 1 from 1956. And we can see this gesture that he really loves, a silhouette behind a glowing curtain like this, but the hand coming out, looking like it's going to pull it back. So after Tooker and Christopher renovate this Brooklyn brownstone, they are living there, and right across the street from them is a Puerto Rican boarding house. So there's this fascination of looking into other people's windows. It's very similar to the work that Edward Hopper was doing from right around the same time. And it inspired so many paintings on the part of Gearge Tooker. Probably never exact copies of what he was seeing out his own window, but we get that wonderful sense of visual eavesdropping when we look into a window like this. Tooker just loved the format of a window. It's an easy frame, right? And we love to peek into people's lives. So in this picture, we have this totally exhausted looking woman in the foreground, leaning up against the windowsill. We've got a little bit of a trompe l'oeil effect, this fool the eye effect, with her fingers coming over into our space. Notice how this gesture where she's supporting her own head this way is almost directly mimicking what we see here with the gesture of the anonymous man just behind her. So she's got this red tank top on, and that is sort of echoed with these red curtains in the room. What we do see way beyond them, and again, there's that shift of space, sort of similar to Piero della Francesca, like we saw before, is just another shirtless man in this room, and he looks a little bit zoned out. So we don't know the relationship between these 3 figures. There's a sense of sensuality here because we have people in various states of undress, but we don't know what exactly is happening. And again, that wonderful sense of mystery of who's behind the curtain. Well, he gives us a peek in this wonderful picture, window 2. This is actually from the same year, and a lot of similar motifs, but now it's daylight. The curtain has been pulled back. We see this wonderful pose of the arm straight across the forehead like this, where it's reinforcing the angularity of the window format itself. And in this case, he seems to be looking out and down the window. Maybe there's something happening on the street. Our eyes are called down to this windowsill because we've got the pop of color, we've got the fruit, we've got the flowers here. It's a beautiful little still life. And then we notice this really haunting figure who is looking out directly at us. We don't quite know who this is. I'm assuming it's a woman, but a lot of these figures are kind of androgynous. And she seems to be peeking over this little piece of furniture. She's a haunting presence, to say the least. But then we begin to imagine, what is the relationship between these two people? Was something intimate happening in this room? Does she realize that she's been exposed somehow? But we're left trying to figure this out. So this brings us to this next wonderful painting called Guitar from the following year. And Tooker revisits this theme of a pair of people in a room, in this case, very explicitly lovers, that we see through this open window. Importantly here, he has made this an interracial couple. This is 1957. This is a white man choosing to do this in the art world. It's really unusual. This is, of course, like a decade before interracial marriage rules were, or bans against interracial marriage were ruled illegal by the Supreme Court. So here we see a man smoking a cigarette, sort of embracing this guitar on the left as his lover reclines on the right. And her torso, of course, is meant to echo the form of this guitar here. Tooker added another nice little trompe l'oeil element with these red ribbons coming off of the strap of the guitar. Apparently his art dealer told him that it made the paintings a lot easier to sell that way. But it's sort of a softer scene, and there's just something really, I think, beautiful, lovely, romantic in the way that he's painted this guitar player over here. So he goes back to this window concept again and again. He goes back to the idea of interracial relationships. And here over on the right, I think he's even suggesting a homosexual couple here. But of course, this is so unusual in the art world because so many of these relationships still had to be conducted in the shadows for the very safety of the people in the relationships. Notice that he's using this very similar format of these kind of angular poses here that reinforce the angles of the window format to begin with. I should mention that Tooker loved to paint torsos, probably almost as much as Michelangelo. But there's an element here that's connected to the art historical concept of Saint Sebastian. Saint Sebastian was a Christian saint that was sentenced to death by a firing squad of archers. So you oftentimes see this saint who's just riddled with arrows, and he's usually tied to a tree like this, and his arms might be up over his head. And there's this accentuation of his physical perfection a lot of the time. So we see almost a reference to Saint Sebastian in these paintings, because Saint Sebastian sort of turns into this gay icon. Not only is there something erotic to the way that he's painted, but this notion of suffering, the slings and arrows of what society throws at you, is certainly something that the gay community could connect with. So we see a little bit of that coming out in, especially in so many of his paintings of shirtless men. So let's turn our attention from windows now to doors. And this is such an interesting transition in Tooker's work, because we move from being voyeurs to having a barrier. And what does that mean when we have a barrier? In this picture, which is a little bit unusual in his body of work about doors, we see these three doors arranged very closely together, and this hallway here. Some critics said, what is this nonsensical space that he's painted? It was actually his apartment. So we see a semi-nude woman coming out of one door. We see another semi-nude figure on a piece of furniture through the other door. And then the third door here is cracked open just enough that it's letting this beautiful daylight spill into this space, or what I imagine daylight. We never know the light source, right? So we don't know the nature of the relationships here. The architecture seems a little bit unusual. If it's reminding you of Edward Hopper, you are not off base. Like I mentioned before, these two artists knew each other and were familiar with each other's work. So Edward Hopper's painting Rooms by the Sea from 1951 was done just 2 years before Tooker painted the image on the right. So in both of these pictures, we have a real ambiguity here. These are paintings that seem to be realistic, abstract, and surrealistic all at once. Okay, so doors turn into something a little bit different for Gearge Tooker, and they are haunting. They go to sort of a dark place. Windows allowed visual access, but no real physical connection to the subject. These doors obscure, they shut out, and they act as barriers between his figures. This is a painting called Voice One. And it shows almost two identical men here on opposite sides of a door or a wall, and they're trying to communicate. One of them has his mouth open, and the other one is pressing his ear against that door. If this is a door, there's almost a silliness to this, right? It's like he could just look around the door, but instead he's trying to make sense out of what he's hearing. What does that voice sound like to you as you're looking at this picture? What is the reaction here? To me, this always seems like a setup from a scary movie. There seems to be something like aching and slightly urgent and on the face of the figure on the left. And there is something, there's a real hesitancy in the face of the man on the right. So we can all begin to imagine what that voice might sound like. And this is a setup that Tooker goes back to a number of times. In Voice 2, which was painted in 1972, this is at the National Academy of Design, we see almost the exact same composition. Now it's just a little bit more compressed. Now our protagonists here are African-American, but the color has sort of been drained from the picture itself. I would say that there's even more of an urgency from this figure who is doing the talking, whose voice is coming through the wall, and more of a sense of alarm from the person that is listening here. So what happens next? Well, if these voice pictures are about anxiety, then these pictures are really about how we deal with these anxieties. So in the painting called The Door over here from 1970, Tooker shows us a man who is forcefully trying to close this door, seemingly barricading it with his body. He wants nothing to do with the voice or the message coming from beyond, but we see this sadness in his expression here, a sense of just resolution. We get the sense that that the message from that voice has already been received. Over here on the right, we have a figure on the right side of the door who is now alone. He's holding himself in the shallow space and he's staring forward. He almost looks traumatized, doesn't he? And it looks like he is the figure that has become ghost-like now. So really haunting images here. It gets a little bit worse, but bear with me. Okay, so the door becomes this barrier almost between life and death. This is a picture called The Lesson from 1974. We have these two slightly androgynous figures, one of them who seems like she's alive, and one of them who seems like they've gone to the great beyond here. And this is the lesson is coming from the dead with this shriek, this grimace, with these skeletal fingers kind of wrapping around the edge of the door. And we can see this younger version of this skeletal figure kind of hovering in the shadows here, really scared and alarmed by what that message might be. And then we have this dramatic arc of this red floral wreath here, which kind of reminds me of like a funerary wreath. So the door is this barricade between our world and like I said, the great beyond. So it becomes a place for grieving in some of Tooker's paintings. On the right, on the left, we have woman at the wall, and then over here, standing figures. We can see this woman who stands against the wall. It's very similar to the pose and composition of this figure amongst the standing figures. Now the doors have become these human-sized boxes, and each figure is pressed up against a box in this infinite space. It's a place of grief. It's a place of isolation. We see once again that Tooker is using the built environment to suggest how modern life is compartmentalized, how lonely it is. Is this his vision of the afterlife? Well, we'll round out windows and doors with this work here, and it seems like the natural evolution, right? Now it seems as though those doors have morphed into tombstones for us. Once again, here the architecture is limitless. So perhaps this is a view of the afterlife. This is called Landscape with Figures 2 from 1966. And it seems as though we're looking at the dead rising from their graves. Some of them are embracing each other. Some of them are confronting their own death. Some of them are sort of having this moment of revelation here. There's this yellowy green light coming in from outside of the picture. We don't know if it's a revelation really or some sort of resurrection, but either way, we've seen how Tooker uses the simple concept of a separating wall or a door to explore some of the most significant divisions in our life. Let's turn our attention really quickly to light and love. Now, light is a subject that he can handle really well with tempera paint. It's like all of these layers of color, and we see this kind of luminosity to his pictures. But once again, a stillness. This is called Jukebox from 1953. And even though there's this modern music machine here, nobody's dancing. There's this wonderful kind of twisted pattern within the jukebox, echoing the crepe paper on the ceiling. But we get this sense of watchfulness and of stillness in this scene. Gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous colors though, right? And he begins to do a whole series on these Japanese paper lanterns, this fascination with glowing light. But even though these are garden party scenes, there is this sense of solemnity to them. You don't get the sense that it's actually something festive. It's an opportunity for him to paint this light, to paint these beautiful glowing lanterns, but to maybe suggest that something more serious is taking place. And in this lantern painting over here on the right, I've brought in a comparison here. One of his artistic idols was a Baroque painter named Gearge Tooker. And we can see over here the same fascination with glowing light, particularly how it comes through the hand. We see it with the candle over in de la Tour's painting, and then in the way that this figure here is kind of hugging this lantern. Notice the bowed head in each of these compositions too. He might have been looking directly at de la Tour when he painted it. So from the glowing light and these kind of solemn garden parties, I wanted to show you his scenes of love, really. And he called most of these pictures Embrace. He started painting them in the early 1980s, and they are these very powerful images of human connection. This is the opposite of those windows and doors, right? This is people finally coming together. And so we see it happening in a natural setting. They are far away from the city. The lines of the grasses here sort of echo the lines of their hair. In both of these pictures, whether it's vertical or horizontal, we see just the woman's face and the man's face is obscured. The woman's head is sort of thrown back into the side. It kind of reminds me of the famous Kiss painting from Gustav Klimt, but it's a theme that Tooker goes back to again and again, and he abstracts it a little bit more. In this picture, it's an embrace where we only see the face of the man. He looks so relieved, doesn't he? Or maybe a little bit sad. It's like he's overwhelmed by this touch, by this affection. Perhaps he knows that this will be the last embrace. Look at how their arms come up around each other, how they cradle each other, creating this wonderful swirling pattern right here at the center. But now these rolling hills behind them really become, well, they begin to envelop them. It's like a blanket around them that is further embracing them. And then eventually Tooker takes these figures to the ground, and the embrace here is once again kind of shrouded by this blanket, these beautiful lines of the grass blending in with the hair here, and that lovely, solemn expression on the face of the man here. So really kind of passionate and deeply felt images of love will round things out very quickly with sleep and death. Now we already saw this binary in some of Tooker's paintings. We saw the guitar before, where we had the sleeping figure, but notice she's in the classic pose of sleep in the history of art. If you have your arm up above your head, we know that you're asleep and you're not dead. If you're in bed with your nude lover and we can only see your head, it's safe to assume that you're asleep and not dead. But when it comes to Tooker and sleep, he begins to explore this that blurry line between sleep and death. So with this picture, which he also turned into a relief sculpture, it's called Night One. And now it's not a nude lover in bed with a sleeping figure. Now it's somebody who looks sort of slightly tortured, who is right alongside this sort of face in repose that is snuggled by this pillow or these white linens on either side. So we don't quite know the nature of the relationship between these two figures. And we have to wonder, is this sleep or is this death? And it's a confusion that Tooker's plays with in Sleepers 2. This is from 1959. It's in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. You can see that he's basically just showing us these disembodied heads. Once again, they're all on top of each other, basically. And if they're supposed to be asleep, all of their eyes are open and they all seem to be gazing at the same thing. Some of them with awe, some of them maybe with a little bit of alarm. Is Sleepers, or is this painting Sleepers really supposed to be about death in this case? Is it this sense of what happens to your consciousness after your body is no longer working? So so it's a fascinating blurriness in the distinction between sleep and death. But when Tooker really wants to address the issue of death directly, for instance, right after his own mother passed away, he created these two images called Meadow 1 and Meadow 2 from the early 1960s, where there really is no doubt in terms of this relationship. And he's once again painted a figure that sort of looks like himself, kneeling alongside the past figure who's lying in the grass here. Very powerful images here, and you can really get the sense of grief and mourning. Now, and it's interesting, I think, too, that he places these scenes of really deep emotion in a natural setting here. But Tooker was always somebody who was interested in death. One of his earliest paintings when he was just 26 years old was called The Dance. And in this case, we're looking at a sort of a seedy city street where the sidewalk has torn open and these skeletal figures, one in the foreground, one in the background back here, are finding sinners really and tormenting them. But there is this kind of wonderful choreography that's happening, this X pattern in the way that these limbs are kind of flailing as death is tormenting them. Notice that many of the figures don't even seem to be aware of the fact that death is there. We get another kind of haunting female figure, almost like our queen of the underworld that we saw back with the subway painting, who seems to be looking out at us, or maybe she's aware that death is there. She doesn't seem too disturbed. But I will quickly share with you that I couldn't find a great color reproduction that was high res. So I did find an uncropped version of this painting. And actually, over here on the far left is a self-portrait of the artist. And he's just casually walking on down the street, even though death is not too far away. We'll see that his relationship with death changes pretty quickly. He confronts the theme of death in a series of pictures about mirrors here. This one I think is so successful with the oval of the mirror, the oval of her face, and then this very haunting figure of the skeleton just behind her. So it's a vanitas theme. It's a traditional theme in the history of art. She's even got a little set of pearls here. So she's admiring her own beauty, but the skull there, of course, is the reminder to her and to us that this beauty fades, that all beauty fades, and that we are here for a short time. He goes back to this theme several times. In this case, it's a rectangular mirror, a very similar girl here. And instead of a skull, we've got a flower, and the flower is just starting, the rose is really just starting to shed some of its petals. So the beauty that she sees in the mirror will also fade. And then finally, and perhaps most explicitly, we have this iteration of the series where we have a new young woman also gazing into a mirror, and there's an older version of herself, perhaps it's her mother, perhaps it's her grandmother, who is also gazing into this mirror, just peeking over her shoulder. We don't know the relationship here, but she becomes really the specter of death in this picture. And that brings us to Gearge Tooker, who put himself into this theme. This is his self-portrait from 1996, and he is sort of nervously smiling here. Maybe he's slightly aware of the fact that the skeleton is creeping right up behind him. So we can even see that he's about to put his bony hand on his shoulder. Gearge Tooker seems like he is accepting of whatever fate has in store for him. So let's just wrap up real quick with his legacy. We can see him here in two photos from later on in his life. Gearge Tooker died of kidney failure in his home in Heartland, Vermont in 2011. He was 90 years old. And over the course of his long career, he created less than 175 paintings. He had several major museum exhibitions during his lifetime, including multiple retrospectives at major US museums. And in 2007, we see him here receiving the prestigious National Medal of Arts. So what is our big takeaway when it comes to Gearge Tooker? He was an artist that used luminous color and light to illustrate how people should act towards one another, and painted the consequences of what happens when they don't. He pushed boundaries on topics that were important to him, including social justice and equality, but he did this in his often understated ways. He remains one of the most distinctive, most underappreciated American painters of the 20th century. So I hope this was a good primer for you on Gearge Tooker. I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you have about the artist. I'll start looking at the chat here. Margaret, thanks for your kind words. Norm, also very nice. Thanks for your kind feedback. I appreciate that. There's a lot to take in, really, and some of these images are just, they can be haunting, but it's so interesting to think of how he kind of slowly develops a theme over many years. It's a lot of fun to see it all together like this. Cecilia, thanks for your kind words too. Joyce asks, what sources did you consult to prepare for your program? Are his pieces in a particular gallery? Oh, thanks for asking, Joyce. I would say the seminal text on Gearge Tooker is this one here by Thomas Garber. And this is the book that I almost like grew up with this book, really familiar with these images and what was written about it. And what's sort of sad about it is that even though I think it was published in like in the 1990s, they still refer to William Christopher as being his friend and not his lover, which is so sad because he was out. So that's a great resource if you want to learn more about him. And in terms of where his work is now, his estate went to a gallery called the DC Moore Gallery. I think they're in New York City, but many of his works went to significant collections of American art. And because he has the local ties to Andover Phillips Academy, they have a number of his works there too. So off the top of my head, a couple of other museums that have a lot of his works, the New Britain Museum down in New Britain, Connecticut, and because he was living up by Dartmouth, there's a fair number of works there too. Michelle asked, the first picture of the social commentary at the government office eerily looked like scenes during the pandemic when glass plexiglass was put up and people placed themselves out in lines, at least in the foreground of the painting. You know, Michelle, I think that is a wonderful connection. And I was sort of reminded of that too. And I think that was part of like a really jarring part of the pandemic for us too, that sense that we were putting up these barriers, that there were all these things that were existing that were preventing us from the connections that we were used to. So when we go back to that picture, I could sort of fly back to it just to remind everybody those barriers and just those little gaps there for communication. I think they kind of resonate today still, don't they? I was just at a restaurant earlier today where they still had all the barriers up, and I just thought, oh, how interesting it will be to explain that to my kids years from now. Now a part of our life, right? Margot says, as usual, oh, thank you, Margot, for your kind words. And oh, you've got the Central Vermont connection there. Okay, so maybe you can go over to Dartmouth and check out a few of his works. Yeah, I mean, I'm always interested in these images that just sort of look like these infinite spaces where there's so many people waiting to, waiting to be helped or waiting to be seen, and the endlessness of it. I mean, it really seems like such a part of modern life. And I can't think of other artists that address it in such a powerful way. Well, Gianna, I think we've handled the questions. Michelle, thanks for your kind words too. I appreciate it. And I appreciate everybody taking a risk on an artist that maybe you didn't know as well tonight. So hopefully it was worth your time. Um, Judith says that the subway scene with the woman holding her stomach looks like James Dean. It's interesting that you say that because so many of his figures really, they look androgynous, right? I mean, just the size of her hand here, I think, is sort of not in line with the rest of the proportions of her body. So you might be on the mark with that one, Judith.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Jane, I just have to say, I am so happy I was able to join tonight. I did admit to Jane before the program started that, I went to art school, I majored in art history, and I had not heard of him before, sadly, and I'm very happy that I know more now. Just looking at his compositions, I love how he revisited the same compositions, the same subject matter over and over and over as, this kind of exploration of these topics. So cool. So thank you so much, Jane. And thank you everyone for coming. Just want to let you know a couple upcoming programs next week. We do have a few big ones. We have Food Porn, A History of Images and Cooking on next Tuesday at 7. We have a conversation with author Nancy Horan, the author of The House of Lincoln, next Wednesday. And then on Thursday, we have La Serenissima, A Sojourn in Venice on the 29th. So please join us. All of them are at 7 p.m. online, so register at the library website. And of course, please come back next month for Art on Thursdays, where we talk about Norman Rockwell on art. So again, Jane, thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a good night.
Good night, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Bye.